What really happened to Adolf Hitler after the Second World War? It is one of the most asked questions in modern history, and for decades it has refused to die quietly. Was he truly the man who perished in a concrete bunker beneath the ruins of Berlin on April 30th, 1945? Did he blow his brains out while the Red Army thundered through the streets above, just blocks from his underground lair? Or did he somehow vanish into the chaos of a collapsing empire, slip aboard a waiting submarine, and emerge years later beneath the blazing sun of South America, living out his days under an assumed name while the world burned what it thought were his remains? The question has fueled conspiracy theories, best-selling books, classified intelligence files, and more than a few sleepless nights for historians who have devoted their careers to finding a definitive answer. And the truth, as it turns out, is far more complicated, far more dramatic, and in many ways far stranger than even the most elaborate fiction. In this video, we are going to trace every thread of the story from Hitler's final desperate days inside the Führer bunker in Berlin, through the Soviet discovery of his charred remains, through the decades of conspiracy, the classified FBI reports, the CIA documents that were sealed for 50 years, the skull fragment that turned out not to be Hitler's at all, and the dental evidence that finally, in 2018, gave the world its most definitive answer yet. So without further ado, let us start at the very beginning of the end. To understand what happened to Hitler after the war, we first need to understand the extraordinary circumstances of the final weeks of his life. Because by the spring of 1945, Adolf Hitler was not the same man who had launched his blitzkrieg campaigns across Europe just 5 years earlier. The Führer who had once stood before cheering thousands at Nuremberg, who had turned a humiliated and economically broken nation into the most feared military power on earth in less than a decade, who had conquered Poland in 5 weeks, France in 6, who had brought nearly all of continental Europe under his iron boot, was by early 1945 a wreck. Those who saw him during those final months were shocked at the transformation. He walked with a stoop. His left hand trembled violently and uncontrollably. His face was grey and drawn, his eyes were bloodshot and staring, and he suffered from episodes of dizziness and intense abdominal cramping that bent him double. His personal physician, Theodor Morell, had been injecting him for years with a cocktail of drugs that historians now believe included methamphetamine, opioids, barbiturates, and even preparations made from animal organs. Some researchers have suggested that Hitler's erratic behaviour and his increasingly detached decision-making in the final year of the war were at least partly the result of what was essentially a severe addiction to these substances, layered on top of what many psychiatrists have retrospectively diagnosed as a combination of narcissistic personality disorder and possible Parkinson's disease, which would explain the trembling that witnesses describe so vividly. But Hitler's physical deterioration was only part of the picture. The military situation around him was catastrophic in a way that admitted no honest interpretation except total defeat. By January 1945, the Red Army under Marshal Georgy Zhukov had launched its massive Vistula-Oder offensive, smashing through German defences in Poland and racing westward at a pace that stunned even the Soviet high command. In the West, the Allied forces had recovered from the shock of the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last great gamble in the West, which had failed to split the Allied lines and capture the critical port of Antwerp as planned. By February, American forces under General Omar Bradley had reached the Rhine, and by March they had crossed it. Germany was being squeezed from both sides, simultaneously, and there was nothing left in the tank, literally and figuratively, to stop either advance. The Wehrmacht had been bled white on the Eastern Front. The Luftwaffe had ceased to exist as a meaningful fighting force. The German Navy had been reduced to scattered U-boats and coastal vessels. Fuel, ammunition, food and men were all running out at the same time, and the industrial heartland of the Ruhr Valley was about to be encircled by the Western Allies. Any general officer who looked at the strategic map without ideological blinders could see that the war was irretrievably lost. Several of them said so, and some of them paid for that honesty with their careers. Hitler, however, refused to accept it. This is perhaps the most important thing to understand about the final chapter of his life. His decision to remain in Berlin, to stay in the bunker until the very end rather than flee to a mountain redoubt or escape by submarine or aircraft, was not made out of ignorance. He knew the military situation. He received briefings every day. What drove his decision was a combination of ego, ideology, and a kind of apocalyptic fatalism that had always lurked beneath the surface of his worldview. In his mind, if Germany could not win this war, then Germany did not deserve to survive it. He had said as much on multiple occasions to multiple witnesses. The Nero decree he had issued in March 1945, ordering the destruction of all German infrastructure so that it could not fall into Allied hands, was the clearest expression of this nihilistic logic. His generals refused to carry it out, but the fact that he issued the order tells you everything you need to know about his state of mind in those final weeks. He was not planning a future for himself or for his country. He was planning a funeral pyre. The Führer bunker itself was a remarkable and deeply strange place during the final weeks of April 1945. Located roughly 50 feet beneath the Reich Chancellery. Garden in central Berlin, it had been constructed in two separate phases. The older section, known as the Vorbunker, was built in 1936 and connected via a long stairway to the newer, deeper section, which had been completed in 1944. The deeper bunker was divided into roughly 30 small rooms, including Hitler's private quarters, a conference room, offices for his closest aides, medical facilities, and generator rooms that provided power when the city above was blacked out or shattered by artillery. The walls were reinforced concrete, several feet thick, and the whole structure was topped by a great mound of earth and rubble that provided some protection from the aerial bombardment that had been systematically dismantling Berlin since 1943. In its final weeks, the bunker housed not just Hitler and Eva Braun, but also Joseph and Magda Goebbels with their 6 children, Hitler's military aides and adjutants, his secretaries Traudl Junge and Christa Schröder, various SS security personnel, and a rotating cast of generals and party officials who came and went as the situation above deteriorated hour by hour. The atmosphere inside was described by survivors as a mixture of surreal normalcy and creeping terror. People ate their meals, attended briefings, exchanged gossip, and celebrated birthdays while the ground above them shook with explosions, and the sounds of a city being turned into rubble drifted down through the ventilation shafts. Hitler continued to hold his twice-daily military conferences, poring over maps that showed phantom armies and non-existent reserves, issuing orders to units that no longer existed or could no longer receive commands, raging at generals who he accused of cowardice or betrayal when their depleted forces failed to execute counterattacks that had never been remotely feasible. Those who attended these conferences described them as increasingly disconnected from reality. Hitler would move pins across maps, order formations forward that had already been destroyed, and dismiss reports of Soviet advances as exaggerated or defeatist. His rages, always a feature of his command style, became more frequent and more explosive. On April 22nd, he had a catastrophic breakdown during the afternoon briefing when informed that the SS Panzer Corps he had ordered to counterattack south of Berlin had failed to do so. He screamed for hours, declared that the war was lost, condemned the entire German military leadership as traitors and cowards, and then, for a brief moment, told those present that he would stay in Berlin and shoot himself when the time came, rather than surrender. It was the first time, witnesses said, that he had spoken openly and directly of his own death. Before we can understand the debates and controversies that followed his death, we need to examine closely the events of those final 2 weeks, because they shaped everything that came after. On April 20th, 1945, Adolf Hitler turned 56 years old. It was his last birthday, though he did not know with absolute certainty that it would be. A small gathering was organised in the bunker, attended by Goebbels, Göring, Himmler, Ribbentrop, Speer, Bormann, Dönitz, Keitel, and others, most of whom had not seen Hitler in weeks. Those who were present later described their shock at his appearance. He seemed to have aged 10 years since they had last seen him. Stooped and shaking, his voice barely above a murmur at times, then rising suddenly into querulous complaint. For a few hours, a kind of grim normalcy prevailed, with congratulations exchanged and birthday wishes offered. Then the guests departed, one by one, many of them leaving Berlin for the last time and never seeing Hitler again. Göring headed south to Bavaria. Himmler also left Berlin. Within days, both men would commit what Hitler considered acts of treachery, and both would pay a steep price for it. The days that followed April 20th saw Berlin rapidly encircled by Soviet forces. By April 25th, the ring around the German capital was essentially closed. There was no longer any realistic prospect of a breakout or a relief force reaching the city. Hitler remained in the bunker, continuing his daily rituals with an eerie stubbornness. He walked his German shepherd dog, Blondie, through the small garden above the bunker. He received reports. He dictated correspondence. He ate his meals at odd hours, often after midnight. He reviewed his old photographs. He talked at length, sometimes through the entire night, with his secretaries and Eva Braun, who had arrived at the bunker on April 15th against his explicit wishes. She had driven from Munich because, she said, she would not leave him. It was a decision that sealed her fate. Amid all of this, two events occurred that shattered whatever remained of Hitler's trust in his own inner circle. On April 23rd, Reich Marshal Hermann Göring, who was sheltering in Berchtesgaden in Bavaria with what remained of his personal staff, sent a telegram to the bunker. In it, he asked Hitler whether, given that the Führer appeared to be cut off in Berlin and unable to exercise effective control over the Reich, he should assume leadership of the government and the armed forces under the terms of Hitler's succession decree from 1941. It was, by almost any reasonable interpretation, a legalistic but sincere attempt to ensure continuity of leadership in a collapsing situation. Hitler interpreted it as a coup attempt. He was beside himself with fury. At Martin Bormann's urging, he declared Göring a traitor, stripped him of all his titles and positions, and ordered his arrest by the SS. Göring was placed under house arrest in Bavaria, stripped of his decorations, and faced the very real prospect of being shot. That he survived until the Allied liberation was largely a matter of geography and timing. The second betrayal was, if anything, even more shocking to Hitler. On April 28th, a BBC radio broadcast was intercepted in the bunker reporting that Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, and the man Hitler had long considered one of his most loyal subordinates, the man he called Der treue Heinrich, meaning faithful Heinrich, had been conducting secret surrender negotiations with the Swedish Red Cross representative, Count Volker Bernadotte. Himmler had apparently convinced himself that the Western Allies would accept a separate peace with Germany if it was offered by the right person through the right channels, and that he himself might be acceptable to them as a post-war leader. He was catastrophically wrong about this, but what mattered in the immediate moment was that the news reached Hitler in the bunker. The reaction was described by eyewitnesses as the worst rage they had ever seen from him, and given everything they had already witnessed, that was saying something. Himmler, faithful Heinrich, was a traitor. The betrayal cut far deeper than Göring's because it seemed to Hitler to confirm his worst fears about the entire world having turned against him in his final hours. He had Himmler's liaison officer in the bunker, Hermann Fegelein, arrested and shot as a reprisal. Fegelein, who was also Eva Braun's brother-in-law and had been trying to escape the bunker in civilian clothes, was executed in the garden on April 28th. The order for Himmler's own arrest was issued, though by that point Himmler was beyond Hitler's reach. He would eventually be captured by British forces, and on May 23, 1945, he bit down on a cyanide capsule during a medical examination and died within minutes. On the night of April 28th to 29th, with Soviet troops now fighting their way through streets just blocks from the Reich Chancellery, Adolf Hitler married Eva Braun. The ceremony was brief and deeply peculiar, conducted by a Berlin city councillor named Walter Wagner, who had been located and brought to the bunker for the purpose. The witnesses were Joseph Goebbels and Martin Bormann. Wore a black silk taffeta dress. One of her favourites. Hitler wore his uniform. There was a small champagne reception afterward, at which Hitler sat and talked with his secretaries while his new wife sat beside him. Later that night, in the small hours of April 29th, Hitler dictated his personal will and his political testament to Traudl Junge. These documents, which survive and have been extensively analysed, are remarkable in their combination of mundane personal arrangements and vicious ideological fury. In the political testament, he expelled Göring and Himmler from the Nazi Party, appointed Admiral Karl Dönitz as his successor as Reich President, named Goebbels as Reich Chancellor, and blamed the Jews for starting and prolonging the war. He expressed no regret for the deaths of tens of millions of people, offered no acknowledgement of any moral failing, and ended with a call to the German people to continue the struggle and never surrender. In his private will, he left his property to the Nazi Party and requested that his body be burned after his death, as he did not wish it to be put on display as Mussolini's had been after the Italian dictator was shot by partisans and hung upside down in a Milan petrol station just 2 days earlier, on April 28th. The fate of Benito Mussolini clearly weighed on Hitler's mind in those final hours. He and Eva Braun had discussed the manner of their deaths at some length, and he was determined that their bodies would not fall into Soviet hands intact. the question of what method he would use to kill himself had apparently been a subject of genuine deliberation. There were concerns that the cyanide capsules that had been obtained through the SS might have been tampered with or might be ineffective given the sweeping betrayals of the final days. To test the potency of the capsules, Hitler had his dog Blondie poisoned with one of them in the garden of the bunker on the evening of April 29th. Blondie died within seconds. The cyanide worked. Hitler was reportedly upset by the dog's death, though this apparently did not alter his own plans. What also needs to be understood about this period is the broader context of who else was making fateful decisions in the bunker and how their choices would shape the historical record for decades to come. Martin Bormann, Hitler's personal secretary and the man who had gradually accumulated enormous power by controlling access to the Führer, was at this point almost certain to try to escape Berlin rather than die with his master. He had been sending and receiving coded messages, managing Hitler's final administrative affairs, and positioning himself as indispensable until the very end. The question of what happened to Bormann after Hitler's death would itself become one of the great post-war mysteries, with theories ranging from escape to South America to death in Berlin, before DNA evidence finally provided a definitive answer decades later. Goebbels, by contrast, had made a different choice entirely. He would stay, he would die, and in the most horrifying possible fashion, he would take his 6 children with him. Magda Goebbels administered cyanide to Helmut, Hildegard, Helmut, Haldane, Hedwig and Heidrun, aged between 4 and 12 years old, on the night of May 1st, and then she and Josef Goebbels died in the garden of the Reich Chancellery by gunshot and poison. Their bodies burned as Hitler had requested for his own. It was an act so extreme, so fundamentally incomprehensible, that it has haunted historians and psychologists ever since. But we are getting slightly ahead of ourselves, because before any of that occurred, the most consequential event of the entire post-war mystery took place in Hitler's private study on the afternoon of April 30th, 1945. Let us turn now to the death itself, and to all the extraordinary controversies that followed from it. By the morning of April 30th, Soviet forces were fighting in the Tiergarten, just a few hundred meters from the Reich Chancellery. They had taken the Moltke Bridge, they were advancing on the Reichstag, and artillery shells were landing in the garden directly above the bunker with increasing regularity. The air inside the bunker was thick with smoke and the smell of fuel and fear. Hitler had spent much of the night awake, had eaten a modest lunch at around 1 in the afternoon, and had said his final farewells to the remaining bunker staff. He shook hands and exchanged brief words with each person individually, including his secretaries, Traudl Junge and Gerda Christian, his cook, Constanze Manziali, and various military and SS aides. Witnesses described the scene as eerily quiet and formal, almost ceremonial. Hitler's face was expressionless, his eyes distant. Eva Braun, by contrast, was emotional, crying openly before composing herself for the formal farewells. After the goodbyes, Hitler and Eva Braun retired to his private suite of rooms. With them, they carried their method of death. Eva had a cyanide capsule. Hitler had a cyanide capsule and his personal pistol, a Walther PPK 7.65mm. He intended to use both, perhaps doubting that the cyanide alone would be sufficient or fast enough. At approximately 3:30 in the afternoon, a single gunshot was heard from inside Hitler's private study. Within minutes, 2 of his aides, Otto Günsche and Heinz Linger, entered the room. What they found has been described in their testimonies and memoirs, both of which survived the war and have been studied extensively by historians. Hitler was slumped on the sofa, a gunshot wound to his right temple, blood soaking into the cushions and running down onto the floor. Eva Braun was beside him. No visible wound, but the smell of bitter almonds, which is associated with cyanide, was strong in the room. She had bitten down on her capsule. She had died first, or simultaneously. The exact sequence was never determined with certainty. What was determined was that Hitler had shot himself. The gun was on the floor, beside his right hand. Whether he also took the cyanide at the same moment has been a matter of some debate, because some post-mortems of the skeletal fragments later found suggested the presence of cyanide poisoning in addition to the gunshot wound, while others did not. But the overall picture, corroborated by multiple eyewitness accounts from people who entered the room within minutes of the shots, was consistent. Adolf Hitler had shot himself in the head, and Eva Braun had poisoned herself with cyanide, and both were dead by approximately 3:30 in the afternoon of April 30th, 1945. What happened next was carefully planned and has been documented in detail. The bodies were wrapped in blankets by Günsche, Linger, and several SS. Guards carried up the stairs and through the emergency exit into the Reich Chancellery garden and laid in a shallow pit that had been prepared for the purpose. Several cans of petrol were poured over the bodies. The group retreated to the doorway. A flaming rag was thrown onto the corpses, and they burned. This was not a quick process. Human bodies do not combust easily, and petrol fires, while intensely hot, do not burn long enough to reduce a body to ash without additional fuel. The bodies burned for several hours, fed with additional petrol by SS guards who made periodic forays into the smoke-filled garden while Soviet shells continued to land nearby. By evening, what remained was badly charred and partially consumed, unrecognizable as either person by physical appearance alone. The remains were covered with soil in the pit, which was then essentially forgotten in the chaos of the final collapse of the Reich, as the remaining bunker staff began attempting their own escapes. Through the burning streets of Berlin. And here, right here, is where the mystery begins. Because the Soviet forces who entered Berlin and took control of the Reich Chancellery area in the first days of May 1945 found the bunker, found the garden, found evidence of burning, and began conducting their own investigation into what had happened. What they found, what they chose to reveal, and what they chose to conceal would set the stage for decades of uncertainty, rumour, and conspiracy theory about whether the most hated man in history had actually died in that garden or had somehow gotten away. The Soviet investigation was led by SMERSH, the Soviet military counterintelligence organization, and it was conducted in conditions of extraordinary secrecy under direct orders from Joseph Stalin himself. The Soviets recovered various physical remains from the garden and the surrounding area, including charred skeletal fragments, a jaw fragment with bridgework and dental remains, and other miscellaneous items. They also captured and interrogated dozens of bunker survivors and Reich Chancellery staff. The Soviet forensic specialists who examined the dental remains were able to match them against Hitler's dental records, which had been reconstructed from memory by his dental assistants Käthe Häusermann and Fritz Echtmann, both of whom had worked in the practice of Hitler's dentist Hugo Blaschke. The match was, according to the Soviets' own internal documents, convincing. But here is where Stalin made a decision that would haunt the historical record for half a century. Stalin chose not to tell anyone. He chose not to announce publicly that Soviet forces had found and identified Hitler's remains. When American, British, and French officials asked what the Soviets had found, Stalin told them that Hitler had probably escaped, that he might have fled to Spain or Argentina, and that the Soviets had not been able to confirm his death. He said this privately to Western leaders and allowed the ambiguity to fester publicly. At the Potsdam Conference in July 1945, when President Truman pressed Stalin directly on the matter, Stalin replied that, in his opinion, Hitler had escaped and was hiding somewhere, probably in Spain or South America. Why did Stalin do this? Historians have proposed several explanations. One is that he wanted to maintain pressure on the Western powers by keeping alive the spectre of a surviving Hitler who might rally fascist movements. Another is that he simply did not trust the forensic evidence fully and was genuinely uncertain. A third is that he was playing a geopolitical game, creating uncertainty that served Soviet interest in the early Cold War. Whatever his reasons, the effect was catastrophic for historical clarity. The world's most powerful communist leader had just told the Western powers that Hitler might still be alive, and the conspiracy machine, which would grind for decades to come, had been handed its starter fuel by none other than Stalin himself. The Soviet files on the discovery and examination of the remains were classified at the highest level and would not be open to outside researchers until after the fall of the Soviet Union. For over 4 decades, the Soviets maintained official silence about exactly what they had found in that garden. The jaw fragment and other remains were kept in Soviet archives, their existence not publicly acknowledged. The skull fragment, which became one of the most debated pieces of physical evidence in the entire post-war controversy, was kept separately and was not widely known about outside Soviet intelligence circles until it surfaced dramatically in Russian archives in the 1990s. When American researchers examined this skull fragment, they made a stunning discovery that we will discuss in detail in a moment. A discovery that reignited all of the conspiracy theories that many historians had believed were finally put to rest and forced a thorough reassessment of the physical evidence for Hitler's death. But before we get to that, let us follow the threads of the conspiracy theories themselves, because they deserve careful examination. The idea that Hitler had not died in the bunker but had somehow escaped began circulating almost immediately after the end of the war in Europe in May 1945. Some of these theories were the product of genuine confusion and the fog of war. Some were deliberately cultivated by parties with political interests in maintaining uncertainty. And some were the work of people who would have preferred, for ideological reasons, to believe that Hitler had survived and might one day return. The sheer number of reported sightings and rumours that began accumulating in the immediate post-war period was astonishing and, in retrospect, tells us a great deal about the psychological landscape of a world that had just emerged from 6 years of industrial-scale violence and was struggling to make sense of how it had all happened. The most persistent and elaborate of the escape theories centered on Argentina, a country that had maintained a stance of at least nominal neutrality through much of the war, had significant populations of German and Italian immigrants, and was governed during the war years by a succession of military juntas and eventually by Juan Perón, whose administration was notably sympathetic to European fascists. The theory went like this. Hitler had escaped the bunker through some combination of forged documents, loyal SS escorts, and perhaps a submarine, had made his way to a neutral port, and had eventually arrived in Argentina, where he lived under an assumed name protected by the network of former Nazis who settled there in large numbers after the war. This theory has been written about in multiple books, most famously by the Argentine journalist Uki Gonyi, whose exhaustive research on the actual networks that did help Nazi war criminals escape to Argentina after the war. Networks which absolutely existed and are historically documented gave the escape theories a veneer of structural plausibility, even if the specific claim about Hitler himself remained entirely without credible physical evidence. We will examine all of this in much greater detail as we move through the story. But what you need to understand at this stage is that the conspiracy theories were not born in a vacuum. They were born in a world that had good reason to know that Nazi criminals were escaping justice, that intelligence services on multiple sides had been playing murky games during and after the war, that physical evidence was scarce, contested, or outright hidden, and that a man with virtually unlimited resources and the loyalty of fanatical followers had theoretically had the means and opportunity to stage his own death if he had chosen to. Whether he made that choice is the question. And the answer, when all the evidence is assembled and weighed carefully, is one that the historical and forensic communities have increasingly converged upon. But getting to that answer required decades of painstaking work and more than a few dramatic revelations along the way. Let us now turn to the Soviets' own investigation in detail, because it is in the Soviet files, kept secret for so long that many of the most important clues were buried. SMERSH, the acronym standing roughly for Death to Spies in Russian, was the Soviet military counterintelligence service that had spent the entire war hunting enemy agents, rooting out deserters, and conducting the kind of brutal, relentless security work that Stalin's regime demanded. By the time Soviet forces entered Berlin in late April and early May of 1945, SMERSH had been reorganized and reoriented toward a new mission: finding, capturing, and extracting every piece of military, political, and scientific intelligence from the defeated enemy before the Western Allies could get to it. This included, critically, the physical evidence relating to the fate of Adolf Hitler and other senior Nazi figures. The unit tasked with investigating the Reich Chancellery area was led by a SMERSH officer, whose name appears in the declassified Soviet files as Lieutenant Colonel Ivan Klimenko. His team arrived at the Reich Chancellery compound in the first days of May and began a systematic examination of the grounds. They found the bunker, descended into it, found the evidence of Hitler's final days, and then turned their attention to the garden, where the smell of burned flesh and petrol still lingered over the shallow pit in which the bodies had been buried. The initial excavation of the pit produced charred remains that were in extremely poor condition. The petrol fires that had burned for hours on the afternoon and evening of April 30th had done significant damage, but as any forensic specialist would confirm, they had not reduced the remains to pure ash. Human teeth and dense bone structures, particularly fragments of bone, charred flesh adhering fragments of bone, charred flesh adhering to some of them, and crucially, a jaw fragment with dental bridgework still partially intact. They also found, near the surface of the pit, a partial skull with what appeared to be a gunshot entrance wound above the left eye socket. These remains were carefully collected, placed in separate containers, and transported to Soviet military facilities for examination. Over the following days, Soviet forensic pathologists working under conditions of extreme secrecy conducted examinations of what they had found. The critical breakthrough came from the dental records. Hitler's dental history was extensive and, as it turned out, unusually distinctive. He had suffered from serious dental problems throughout much of his life, and his mouth contained a complex arrangement of bridges, caps, and other dental work that his dentist, Hugo Blaschke, had painstakingly constructed and maintained over many years. Blaschke himself had fled Berlin before the Soviet arrival, but two of his key assistants, his dental technician Fritz Echtmann and his dental nurse Kater Häusermann, had remained in the city. The Soviets located both of them and subjected them to detailed interrogation. Separately, each was asked to describe Hitler's dental work from memory, in as much detail as they could recall. Working independently, both Echtmann and Häusermann produced remarkably consistent descriptions of the dental bridge work, the specific locations of crowns, the nature of the bridging materials, and other identifying features. When the Soviet forensic specialists compared these descriptions to the jaw fragment recovered from the garden, the match was, by their own account, highly compelling. The bridge work was distinctive, the arrangement matched what the witnesses described, and the forensic pathologists were satisfied that they had found and identified Hitler's jaw remains. This finding was recorded in Soviet intelligence documents dated May 1945 and classified at the highest level. A formal forensic report was prepared for Stalin's personal attention. The report concluded that the dental evidence was consistent with the remains being those of Adolf Hitler, and that the available evidence supported the conclusion that he had died in the Reich Chancellery Garden on or about April 30th, 1945. However, and this is the crucial point, Stalin did not share this conclusion with the Western Allies, and the report was not made public. Instead, as we noted, Stalin told Western leaders that Hitler had probably escaped. The reasons for this decision, which seems almost inexplicable in retrospect, remain a matter of historical debate. Some Soviet-era documents that have come to light since the archives were opened suggest that Stalin himself had doubts about the completeness of the evidence, though. This may have been a convenient post hoc rationalization for what was essentially a political decision. Others have suggested that Soviet intelligence officers were themselves genuinely uncertain, partly because the remains were so badly damaged and partly because the full picture was assembled over several weeks of investigation rather than in a single, definitive moment. Whatever the precise internal logic, the practical consequence was that the world's most consequential death of the 20th century remained officially unconfirmed for an extraordinary length of time. There was also the matter of the skull fragment. Separate from the jaw remains, the Soviets had recovered a piece of skull with what appeared to be a gunshot wound, which they attributed to Hitler. This skull fragment was stored in the Soviet state archives and was not publicly revealed until 1993, when the Russian Federal Archival Service permitted limited access to documents from this period. The fragment appeared in an exhibition of documents related to the Second World War and was presented as physical evidence of Hitler's death. Photographs were published, and the fragment attracted significant attention from historians and forensic specialists worldwide. It seemed at first to be a powerful confirmation of the long-standing historical consensus that Hitler had died in the bunker. But the story of the skull fragment was about to take a deeply unexpected turn. In 2009, the History Channel program Hitler's Escape worked with American researchers including archaeologist and anthropologist Nick Bellantoni of the University of Connecticut, who obtained permission to examine the skull fragment held in Russian state archives. Bellantoni and his colleagues conducted DNA testing on the skull fragment, extracting genetic material from a small tooth fragment attached to it. What they found was extraordinary and, for conspiracy theorists, immediately intoxicating. The DNA profile extracted from the skull fragment was genetically female. The skull was not Hitler's. It was the skull of a woman, age unknown, who had no known connection to Hitler or the events in the bunker. This finding, published in peer-reviewed forensic literature and subsequently widely reported in mainstream media, caused a genuine sensation. It meant that one of the two principal pieces of physical evidence that the Soviets had presented as belonging to Hitler was almost certainly not his at all. The skull with the apparent gunshot wound, the dramatic artifact that had been displayed in Russian archives as evidence of Hitler's suicide, was someone else's entirely. This revelation did not, it must be emphasized, prove that Hitler had survived. But it did significantly complicate the evidentiary picture and gave renewed ammunition to those who had always questioned the official account. If the Soviets had mislabeled or misidentified one major piece of evidence, could they have been mistaken about other aspects of the investigation? Could the entire body discovered in the garden have been someone else's, placed there to facilitate an escape? These were the questions that immediately began circulating, and they circulated loudly and persistently. The skull fragment revelation became the centerpiece of a new wave of books, documentaries, and internet content arguing that Hitler had survived and escaped. It was, without question, the single most significant event in the post-war history of the Hitler death mystery since the original Soviet investigation itself. However, as the initial excitement subsided and historians and forensic specialists took a more careful look at what the skull fragment discovery actually meant, a more nuanced picture began to emerge. The skull fragment, it turned out, did not necessarily originate from the same location as the jaw fragment. The Soviets had collected multiple sets of remains from the Reich Chancellery area over a period of days, not all from the same excavation site. There were, in fact, multiple deaths in and around the Reich Chancellery garden during those final days. Eva Braun, Hitler, Goebbels, Goebbels' adjutant, and several SS personnel. The skull fragment with the female DNA could have been Eva Braun's, or it could have belonged to any of several other women who died in the area during that chaotic period. The fact that it was misidentified or misattributed by Soviet archivists does not, by itself, undermine the evidence relating to Hitler specifically, which rested primarily on the dental record match from the jaw fragment, not on the skull. The jaw fragment, crucially, was never subjected to the same DNA testing controversy, because it had been stored differently and in different institutional custody. And it was the jaw fragment that provided the foundation for the most important and definitive forensic analysis of the entire Hitler death question, which came not from the 1990s or the early 2000s, but from a team of French forensic scientists in 2018 in a study that received considerable attention from historians and forensic specialists, but perhaps less public notice than it deserved given its significance. We will examine that study in detail when we reach the appropriate point in our story, because it represents the strongest scientific statement yet made about whether Hitler died in the bunker. But first, let us examine the escape theories themselves with the thoroughness they deserve, because regardless of what the forensic evidence ultimately shows, the theories of Hitler's escape to South America are historically important documents in their own right. And the networks that actually did facilitate the escape of Nazi war criminals are a documented and genuinely shocking chapter of post-war history. The idea that Hitler might have escaped to South America drew sustenance from a very real and very well-documented phenomenon, the massive post-war migration of Nazi war criminals and SS. Officers to Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Paraguay, Bolivia, and other South American countries through a network of escape routes that historians call the rat lines. These were organized systems of document forgery, financial assistance, safe houses, border crossings, and sea passages that helped hundreds and possibly thousands of former Nazis escape justice in the immediate post-war years. The networks involved several distinct but interconnected organizations. One was a network organized by former SS members and Nazi sympathizers within the Catholic Church, particularly through a Vatican official named Bishop Alois Hudal, who was an Austrian Roman Catholic bishop based in Rome, and who made no secret of his sympathy for certain aspects of National Socialism. Hudal helped organize the provision of false documentation, travel permits, and passage to South America for dozens of former Nazis, apparently motivated by a combination of anti-communism and personal ideological sympathy. Another network was the Odessa organization, which stands for Organisation der ehemaligen SS-Angehörigen, or Organisation of Former SS Members, whose actual operational history has been disputed by historians, but which clearly existed in some form and facilitated the escape of significant numbers of former SS personnel. The scale of the Nazi exodus to South America was staggering and is now a matter of historical record. Among those who escaped were Adolf Eichmann, the SS officer who had been the primary logistical architect of the Holocaust, responsible for organizing the deportation of millions of Jews to the death camps. Eichmann escaped to Argentina in 1950 under the assumed name Ricardo Clement and lived openly in Buenos Aires for a decade before being located by Israeli intelligence, abducted, transported to Israel in 1960, tried for crimes against humanity, convicted, and executed by hanging in 1962. His capture and trial sent shockwaves through the communities of escaped Nazis in South America and forced many of them to relocate or go deeper into hiding. Josef Mengele, the SS doctor known as the Angel of Death for his sadistic medical experiments on prisoners at Auschwitz, also escaped to South America, living in Argentina, Paraguay, and Brazil under various false identities. He was never captured. He drowned in the sea off the Brazilian coast in 1979 while suffering a stroke, and his identity was not confirmed until 1985 when his remains were exhumed and forensically identified. Klaus Barbie, the Gestapo chief of Lyon, who was known as the Butcher of Lyon for his role in the torture and deportation of Jews and resistance members, escaped to Bolivia with the help of American intelligence officers who found his anti-communist expertise useful during the early Cold War. He lived in Bolivia for decades under the name Klaus Altmann, until he was identified by Nazi hunters Serge and Beta Klausfeld in 1971. Extradited to France in 1983, tried for crimes against humanity and sentenced to life imprisonment. He died in prison in 1991. The existence and operation of these escape networks and the fact that they successfully concealed so many senior Nazis for so many years is what gave the Hitler escape theories their structural logic. If Eichmann could live openly in Buenos Aires for a decade, if Mengele could spend 30 years in South America without being captured, if the networks existed and functioned, then why not Hitler? The question seems reasonable on the surface. The answer, when examined carefully, comes down to several crucial differences between Hitler's situation and that of men like Eichmann and Mengele. Hitler was not just a war criminal who could change his name and melt into a suburban community. He was, arguably, the most recognized human being on the planet. His face had been on posters, newspapers, and film newsreels throughout the civilized world for over a decade. His mannerisms, his voice, his distinctive physical features including the famous mustache, the dark hair swept to one side, the intense eyes were known to hundreds of millions of people. He suffered from visible physical ailments, including the trembling left hand that was prominent by 1944 and 1945 that would have made disguise extremely difficult. He did not speak any language other than German and a smattering of French. He had no formal education beyond high school and no practical skills or professional background that would allow him to earn a living anonymously. And he was, by the account of virtually everyone who knew him in his final months, a physically broken man who could barely walk without assistance and who was dependent on constant medical treatment. Could such a man have been smuggled out of Berlin under Soviet bombardment, transported secretly to a neutral port, hidden aboard a submarine for a transatlantic crossing, and then lived in quiet obscurity for years in a foreign country? The logistical challenges are not impossible in theory, but they are immense in practice, and they require the sustained cooperation of dozens or hundreds of people, none of whom ever came forward, produced any credible testimony, or left any documented evidence of having participated in such an operation. The conspiracy theorists have an answer for this. The people who knew would never have talked, but this argument proves too much. By the same logic, any absence of evidence can be explained away, and the theory becomes unfalsifiable and therefore scientifically meaningless. One of the most extensive and serious investigations of the Hitler escape theory was undertaken by the Argentine journalist Uki Gonyi, whose 2002 book, The Real Odessa, documented with extraordinary scholarly rigor the actual networks that helped Nazi war criminals escape to Argentina under the Perón government. Gonyi's research, based on access to Argentine government archives that had been classified for decades, showed clearly that the Perón government actively facilitated the entry of Nazi war criminals, and that the scale of the operation was far larger than previously known. However, and this is important, Gonyi's research found no credible evidence that Hitler himself was among those who escaped. The Argentine government files that covered the entry of Nazi refugees, while containing many disturbing names, did not contain Hitler's. The eyewitness testimonies Gonyi collected from former participants in the escape networks mention many prominent Nazis, but not Hitler. Goebbels himself, despite being one of the world's leading experts on Nazi escape routes, has consistently stated that he found no evidence that Hitler survived and escaped to Argentina. The U-boat angle is worth examining in particular detail, because the German submarine fleet in the final weeks of the war does present some theoretical possibilities that deserve scrutiny. As we know from the history of what happened to the German U-boats after the war when Nazi Germany surrendered in May 1945, Admiral Karl Dönitz issued his famous order for all U-boats to surface and surrender to the nearest Allied authority. More than 150 submarines surfaced across the Atlantic, the Bay of Biscay and the fjords of Norway, their exhausted crews hoisting white flags as Allied aircraft circled overhead. They sailed toward ports in Scotland, Northern Ireland and southern England. But not all of them complied immediately or completely. A number of U-boats, perhaps a dozen or more, made unauthorized voyages in the final days and weeks of the war, and at least two of them, U-530 and U-977, arrived in Argentina months after the German surrender in circumstances that initially seemed deeply suspicious and that immediately fueled rumors that they had been carrying important Nazi passengers. U-530 arrived at the port of Mar del Plata in Argentina on July 10, 1945. More than 2 months after the German surrender. The submarine was commanded by Oberleutnant zur See Otto Wermuth, who was 25 years old. The crew surrendered to Argentine naval authorities and were eventually repatriated. The Argentine and American intelligence services questioned Wermuth and his crew extensively about what they had been doing during the 2 months between the surrender and their arrival. Wermuth's explanation was that he had been at sea when the surrender was announced, that he had not wished to risk his crew by sailing into waters controlled by Allied forces while news of the surrender was still fragmentary, and that he had eventually decided to surrender in Argentina because the Argentine government was known to be relatively sympathetic to German naval personnel. He denied categorically that he had carried any passengers, let alone Hitler. American and Argentine interrogators found no evidence contradicting this account, and subsequent declassified intelligence assessments concluded that Wermuth's explanation was plausible and that there was no credible evidence U-530 had carried any VIP passengers. U-977 arrived in Argentina on August 17, 1945. Even later, more than 3 months after the surrender, her commander, Oberleutnant Heinz Schäfer, provided a similar explanation. He had been at sea when the surrender occurred, had received the news via radio, had given his crew the option of being dropped off in neutral Spain to make their own way home, which approximately 15 crew members chose, and had then navigated the Atlantic with a reduced crew before deciding to surrender in Argentina. Schäfer was also extensively interrogated, and he also denied categorically that he had carried any high-ranking Nazi passengers. He later wrote a memoir about his experiences, published in 1952, in which he addressed the Hitler escape rumours directly and dismissed them as fantasy. He had heard the rumours, he wrote, and understood why people found them compelling, but they bore no relationship to the reality he had lived. His submarine had been at sea conducting normal wartime operations, had learned of the surrender, and had made its way to Argentina for the practical and personal reasons he had always described. Despite the lack of any credible evidence linking either U-530 or U-977 to the transport of Hitler or other high-ranking Nazis, these two submarines became permanent fixtures in the Hitler escape mythology. Books published throughout the 1950s, 1960s and 1970s cited them as evidence that Hitler had escaped. The timing of their arrivals, the fact that they had clearly been doing something for those weeks and months between the surrender and their arrival in Argentina, and the romantic appeal of the narrative were sufficient to keep the story alive regardless of what the actual evidence showed. The pattern would be repeated throughout the history of the Hitler escape theories. Circumstantial details that seemed suggestive were elevated to the status of evidence. The absence of contradicting documents was treated as proof of cover-up, and the logical impossibility of keeping such an enormous secret across so many people and so many decades was simply never addressed. The FBI files are another element of this story that deserves careful attention, because the existence of FBI investigations into Hitler's possible survival has been used by conspiracy theorists as evidence that even the American government believed he might have escaped. The truth is considerably more prosaic, Between 1945 and the early 1950s, J. Edgar Hoover's FBI received literally hundreds of reports from informants, immigrants, and ordinary members of the public claiming to have seen Hitler in various locations around the world. These sightings were reported in countries including Argentina, Brazil, Bolivia, Colombia, Denmark, Sweden, Switzerland, Spain, Portugal, and even the United States. The FBI, following its standard procedures for any reported sighting of a significant figure, opened investigation files on these reports, conducted follow-up inquiries, and documented the results. When these files were eventually declassified and made available to the public through Freedom of Information Act requests, they were immediately seized upon by conspiracy theorists as evidence that the FBI had been seriously investigating Hitler's survival. But reading the files themselves tells a very different story. The vast majority of the reports were quickly assessed as lacking credibility. The supposed sightings turned out to be cases of mistaken identity, hoaxes, or the product of overactive imaginations. No FBI investigation ever produced credible evidence that Hitler had survived and escaped. The files document the investigations, not any actual findings of survival. They are evidence of due diligence, not confirmation of escape. The CIA files tell a similar story. In 2017, the CIA declassified a batch of documents from the 1950s that included a report from a CIA asset in Venezuela describing a contact who claimed to have information about Hitler's whereabouts in Colombia. The report was filed as a low-priority intelligence lead, the kind of unverified tip that intelligence services receive and document routinely, and appears never to have been followed up with any seriousness. When the document was discovered in the declassified archive, it received significant media attention, with headlines suggesting that the CIA believed Hitler had escaped to Colombia. The actual document, read carefully, shows nothing of the sort. It records a second-hand, unverified claim from an anonymous informant. It contains no corroborating evidence, no follow-up reporting, and no indication that the CIA gave it any credence. Documents like this are routinely generated by intelligence agencies collecting raw intelligence, and the overwhelming majority of such reports turn out to be worthless. The selective citation of documents like this, stripped of their context, is one of the fundamental methodological problems with the Hitler escape literature. But let us now return to what the historical mainstream has established about Hitler's death, because amid all the theories and controversies, the actual historical record, assembled painstakingly over decades from testimony, documents, and forensic evidence, tells a consistent and coherent story. The testimony of those who were in the bunker in the final days, taken immediately after the war ended, is remarkably consistent across multiple independent witnesses. The secretaries Traudl Junge and Gerda Christian both gave detailed accounts of Hitler's final days and death that were consistent with each other and with the physical evidence. Hitler's valet and bodyguard Heinz Linger, who was one of the first people to enter the room after the shots were fired, gave a detailed account in Soviet captivity that was consistent with what other witnesses said. Otto Günsche, Hitler's personal adjutant, was captured by the Soviets and spent years in Soviet captivity before being released to West Germany, and his account, when it became available, was also consistent. The testimony of General Hans Krebs, the last German officer to leave the bunker alive, was consistent with the overall picture. Even individuals like Rokas Misch, Hitler's personal bodyguard and the bunker switchboard operator, who was the last survivor to leave the bunker alive, and who lived until 2013 at the age of 96, consistently maintained throughout his long post-war life that Hitler had died in the bunker on April 30th, 1945. He described hearing the shot, entering the room, seeing the bodies. He never wavered in his account. Multiple independent witnesses who were physically present in or near the bunker all told the same basic story. The convergence of this testimony is itself a powerful form of evidence. What about the possibility that the witnesses were lying or that they had been coerced or paid to tell a false story? This is the standard conspiracy theory response to witness testimony, and it proves too much. If we are prepared to disbelieve all the testimony of all the witnesses because they might theoretically have been bribed or coerced, we cannot know anything about anything. The specific claim requires specific evidence, and no credible evidence has ever been produced showing that any of the bunker witnesses were paid, coerced, or knowingly lying about what they saw. Some of them, like Linger and Günsche, spent years in Soviet captivity, and would have had every incentive to cooperate with Soviet interrogators if those interrogators had wanted them to say something different. The Soviet files show that Smersh conducted extensive and often brutal interrogations of these prisoners, yet their accounts, when compared to what they told Western historians and researchers after their release, remain consistent on the key facts. People who are coordinating a lie across multiple independent witnesses over decades almost always introduce contradictions and discrepancies over time. The bunker witnesses did not. Now let us turn to the question of what happened in the weeks and months immediately after Hitler's death to the people who had been closest to him, because their fates tell us something important about the disintegration of the Nazi Empire and about the world Hitler left behind. The people who had served him, loved him, feared him, and enabled him were now scattered across a shattered continent, each navigating a very different path through the rubble of the Third Reich. Martin Bormann is perhaps the most mysterious figure in this story. Hitler's personal secretary had accumulated extraordinary power over the course of the war by virtue of his control of access to the Führer, and in the final chaos of the bunker, he had been present at almost every significant moment. He witnessed Hitler's marriage to Eva Braun. He signed Hitler's last testament as a witness. He was present when the bodies were burned, and then, in the early hours of May 1st, 1945, he joined the mass escape attempt from the bunker in which groups of survivors tried to fight their way through Soviet lines to safety. What happened to him next became one of the great post-war mysteries. Various people claim to have seen him at various points during the escape attempt, and then he vanished. For decades, rumors circulated that he had escaped to South America and was living there, perhaps in the same communities of former Nazis that sheltered Eichmann and Mengele. Extensive searches were conducted by German and Israeli authorities. Books were written claiming to have identified him in various South American locations, but no credible sighting was ever confirmed, and the documentary trail always went cold. The mystery was finally resolved, definitively, in 1998. A skeleton that had been discovered during construction work in Berlin in 1972 was subjected to DNA analysis using techniques that had not been available when the remains were originally found. The DNA profile was compared against a blood sample provided by a living relative of Bormann, and the match was conclusive. The skeleton was Martin Bormann's. He had died in Berlin, almost certainly on the night of May 1st, 1945, during the escape attempt. Forensic examination of the skeleton suggested that he had taken a cyanide capsule rather than allow himself to be captured. His remains were officially identified, cremated, and scattered in the Baltic Sea in 1999. Martin Bormann had not escaped to South America. He had died within a few hundred meters of the bunker where he had served Hitler to the last. The resolution of the Martin Bormann mystery through DNA evidence is instructive in more ways than one. It demonstrates that even well-established post-war conspiracy theories about Nazi escapes can be definitively resolved when the right physical evidence becomes available, and the right forensic techniques are applied to it. It also demonstrates that the absence of a confirmed death does not, by itself, constitute evidence of escape. Bormann's fate was unknown for over 50 years, and during those 50 years, many people were entirely confident that he was alive in South America. They were wrong. The lesson applies directly to the Hitler case, though the evidence for Hitler's death is, as we shall see, considerably more robust than what existed for Bormann during the decades of uncertainty. The fates of the other senior Nazi figures in the immediate post-war period form a mosaic of destruction, capture, trial, and occasional escape that tells the story of a regime that had built itself on overwhelming force and that was utterly unable to cope with the fact of its own defeat. Let us examine these fates in detail because they matter both as history and as context for understanding what happened to Hitler and the world he had created. Hermann Göring, who had been Reich Marshal of the Greater German Reich, Commander-in-Chief of the Luftwaffe, and the second most powerful man in Nazi Germany for most of the war, ended the conflict under house arrest in Bavaria, stripped of his ranks and positions by Hitler's order for his purported treachery in sending the telegram that suggested assuming leadership. When American forces liberated Berchtesgaden and the surrounding area in early May 1945, Goering's SS guards handed him over. He surrendered personally to American forces on May 6, 1945, apparently expecting to be treated as a political equal by the victors, perhaps to be invited to participate in negotiations about Germany's future. He was swiftly disabused of this notion. He was arrested and eventually transferred to Nuremberg, where he became one of the 21 defendants at the International Military Tribunal, the most significant war crimes trial in history. Goering's conduct at the Nuremberg trials was, in the assessment of many observers, the most skillful and formidable of any of the defendants. He had lost enormous amounts of weight during his incarceration, having been weaned off the paracodeine addiction that had puffed him to grotesque proportions during the final years of the war, and he appeared sharp, lucid, and devastatingly articulate in cross-examination. He challenged the jurisdiction of the tribunal, questioned the legal basis for the charges of crimes against peace, and mounted a vigorous defense that genuinely troubled some of the prosecutors. His cross-examination by the chief American prosecutor Robert Jackson was widely seen as a defeat for the prosecution. But Goering's formidable performance could not overcome the weight of evidence against him. He was found guilty on all 4 counts of the indictment: conspiracy to commit war crimes, crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. He was sentenced to death by hanging. Goering, however, denied the tribunal the satisfaction of carrying out his execution. On the night of October 15, 1946, just hours before he was to be hanged, he crushed a cyanide capsule with his teeth and died in his cell. How he obtained the capsule was the subject of a lengthy investigation that never reached a fully satisfactory conclusion, though theories ranged from a sympathetic American guard to the capsule having been concealed in a fountain pen or some other personal item that had survived the searches. Hermann Goering cheated the hangman, as he had no doubt always intended to do. Of the 21 defendants at Nuremberg, 12 were sentenced to death. 10 of them were hanged on the morning of October 16, 1946, in the gymnasium of Nuremberg prison. They were Joachim von Ribbentrop, the foreign minister who had negotiated the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with the Soviet Union and had helped set the stage for the war; Wilhelm Keitel, the chief of the Wehrmacht High Command, who had signed some of the most criminal orders of the war and who, in his final statement to the tribunal, expressed regret for having followed orders he knew to be criminal; Alfred Jodl, the chief of operations staff who had been one of Hitler's closest military advisors and who met his death with characteristic German military stoicism; Ernst Kaltenbrunner, the head of the Reich Security Main Office, who had been directly responsible for overseeing the concentration camps and the implementation of the final solution; Alfred Rosenberg, the Nazi Party's chief ideologist, who had developed much of the racial theory that underpinned the Holocaust; Hans Frank, the Governor-General of occupied Poland, who had presided over a territory in which millions of Jews and Poles were murdered and who underwent a dramatic conversion to Catholicism before his execution, expressing what appeared to be genuine remorse; Wilhelm Frick, the Reich Minister of the Interior who had drafted the Nuremberg racial laws; Fritz Sauckel, the Plenipotentiary General for Labour Deployment who had organised the slave labour programme that exploited millions of workers from occupied countries; Julius Streicher, the publisher of the virulently anti-Semitic newspaper Der Stürmer, who was hanged not for any specific criminal act but for incitement to genocide; and Arthur Seyss-Inquart, the Reich Commissioner for the occupied Netherlands, under whose administration tens of thousands of Dutch Jews were deported and murdered. The 11th man sentenced to death in absentia was Martin Bormann, whose fate, as we have seen, had already been determined by a cyanide capsule in a Berlin street in the early hours of May 1, 1945. The executions were carried out by American Army Master Sergeant John C. Woods, who was later criticized for botching some of them, resulting in deaths that were neither clean nor quick. Ribbentrop, who was first, died relatively quickly, but others died more slowly, their necks failing to break instantly. Death coming through slow. Strangulation. The proceedings were witnessed by Allied officers and journalists, and the descriptions they left a grim reading. By the early morning of October 16, 1946, it was over. The principal architects of the Second World War and the Holocaust had been judged and executed. Those who were not executed received prison sentences. Rudolf Hess, who had flown to Scotland in May 1941 on his bizarre self-appointed peace mission and had spent the rest of the war as a British prisoner, was sentenced to life imprisonment. He served this sentence at Spandau Prison in Berlin, eventually becoming its sole remaining prisoner as the others were released or died, until his death in 1987, at the age of 93. The circumstances of his death were for years disputed, with his family arguing that he had been murdered to prevent him from being released, but the official finding was suicide by ligature strangulation. Albert Speer, Hitler's personal architect and Minister of Armaments, received a 20-year prison sentence for his use of slave labour. His strategy of presenting himself as a technocrat who had been unaware of the full extent of the Holocaust, while nonetheless opposing Hitler's final scorched earth plans, was successful enough to save him from hanging. He served his full sentence at Spandau, was released in 1966, and went on to write two highly regarded memoirs, Inside the Third Reich and Spandau, The Secret Diaries, which became bestsellers and made him a wealthy man. Historians have subsequently debated at length how much Speer actually knew about the Holocaust, and the consensus has moved significantly toward the view that he knew considerably more than he claimed. Baldur von Schirach, the former head of the Hitler Youth, received 20 years and was also held at Spandau, released in 1966. The fate of Heinrich Himmler, the man who had built the SS into the state within a state that carried out the Holocaust, deserves its own careful examination. After Hitler ordered his arrest for the Bernadotte negotiations, Himmler was effectively on the run in a country that had ceased to exist as a functioning state. He disguised himself with civilian clothes and a false identity, shaving off his distinctive moustache and wearing an eye patch to alter his appearance. He was travelling with a small group of SS men, trying to make his way through the chaos of post-war Germany. On May 22, 1945, he and his companions were stopped at a British checkpoint near Nuremberg. The British soldiers were conducting routine identity checks on the thousands of displaced people and former military personnel moving through the area. Himmler was initially processed under his false identity, but then identified himself as Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler. He was taken into British custody and transferred to a British internment camp at Barnstead for interrogation. On May 23, 1945, during a medical examination, a British army doctor was checking Himmler's mouth for hidden items when Himmler bit down on a cyanide capsule that had been concealed between his teeth and his cheek. He died within minutes. The man who had been the most powerful figure in the apparatus of mass murder, who had overseen the deaths of 6 million Jews and millions of others in the concentration and death camps, cheated the tribunal that would have tried him with a single bite on a capsule. He was 44 years old. His body was buried in an unmarked grave near Lüneburg, whose exact location was deliberately kept secret by the British authorities to prevent it from becoming a pilgrimage site. Karl Dönitz, who had been appointed Hitler's successor as Reich President in the Political Testament, dictated on April 29th, had the strange distinction of briefly heading a German government, the Flensburg government, after Hitler's death. He had not known he was to be Hitler's successor until he received the telegram informing him of the appointment, and his subsequent actions were those of a man trying to manage an orderly surrender rather than to perpetuate the Nazi regime. He directed the signing of Germany's unconditional surrender on May 7th and 8th, 1945, and continued to function as a nominal head of government for about 3 weeks afterward, until the Allied Control Council dissolved his administration and arrested its members on May 23rd, 1945. Dönitz was indicted at Nuremberg as a major war criminal on charges including conspiracy to commit crimes against peace and war crimes related to unrestricted submarine warfare. His trial was one of the most controversial at Nuremberg, partly because the United States Navy's own Admiral Chester Nimitz submitted an affidavit acknowledging that the American Navy had itself conducted unrestricted submarine warfare in the Pacific from the very first day of the war. This moral equivalence argument was sufficient to spare Dönitz from the more serious charges, and he received a 10-year prison and 20 days in 1958, in which he claimed ignorance of Hitler's crimes against the Jewish people. He died in December 1980 at the age of 89. Erich von Manstein, widely considered one of the most gifted operational commanders of the Second World War, the man whose brilliant Ardennes plan had enabled the rapid defeat of France in 1940, and whose subsequent operations on the Eastern Front had made him a legendary figure in military history, was captured by the British in 1945 and eventually tried before a British military court in Hamburg in 1949. The trial was politically controversial and attracted attention from military figures on both sides who believed Manstein should be treated as a professional soldier rather than a war criminal. He was convicted of a number of charges related to the conduct of the war on the Eastern Front, including failure to prevent the execution of Soviet prisoners of war and the murder of Jews by SS units operating under his command, and sentenced to 18 years in prison. The sentence was later reduced to 12 years, and Manstein was released in 1953 due to health problems. He went on to serve as an unofficial advisor to the West German government on military organization and played a role in shaping the structure of the Bundeswehr, the new West German army. His memoirs, Lost Victories, published in 1955, became one of the most influential accounts of the war from the German perspective and cemented his reputation as a strategic genius while glossing over the darker aspects of his command responsibilities. He died in 1973 at the age of 85. Albert Kesselring, the field marshal known as Smiling Albert for his pleasant demeanour, who had commanded German forces in the Mediterranean and Italy, was tried by a British military court in Venice in 1947. He was convicted of war crimes related to the Ardeatine Cave massacre, in which 335 Italian civilian hostages were executed in March 1944 as reprisals for a partisan attack on German soldiers, and sentenced to death. The death sentence was subsequently commuted to life imprisonment, and Kesselring was released in 1952 due to his declining health. He lived for another 8 years, dying in 1960, and became an active participant in veterans organizations that attempted to rehabilitate the reputation of the German military. He always maintained that his execution of the hostages had been militarily and legally justified under the rules of war as he understood them, a claim that historians have generally rejected. Now we must return to the heart of the matter, the forensic evidence for Hitler's death, and what the most recent and most rigorous scientific analysis tells us about the question of whether he died in the bunker or escaped. Because while the conspiracy theories have been circulating for 80 years, and while the Soviet skull fragment revelation of 2009 temporarily reinvigorated them, the science of forensic dentistry and DNA analysis has continued to advance. And by 2018 it was possible to examine the surviving physical evidence with tools and methodologies that were simply not available to the Soviet pathologists of 1945, or even the Soviet archivists of the 1990s. The 2018 study was conducted by a team of French forensic scientists led by Dr. Philippe Charlier, a forensic pathologist and historian who works at the University of Versailles, and has made a career of applying modern forensic techniques to historical questions, including previous studies on the remains of medieval kings and early modern historical figures. Working in collaboration with Russian state archives, Charlier and his team were granted access to the dental remains that had been recovered from the Reich Chancellery Garden in May 1945 and had been held in Russian custody ever since. These consisted of fragments of dental bridgework and associated dental structures that represented what the Soviet forensic team had originally identified as Hitler's jaw remains. The French team conducted a detailed forensic examination using modern forensic odontology, the scientific discipline that uses dental evidence for identification purposes, comparing the specific characteristics of the surviving dental structures against everything that was known about Hitler's dental history. What they found was striking. The dental structures showed specific features that were consistent with the historical record of Hitler's dental work in several important ways. The bridgework was constructed of a material described as a metal, possibly brass, covered with a white resin, which was consistent with the type of dental work that Hugo Blaschko and his colleagues would have used in Germany in the early 1940s, when more modern dental materials were unavailable due to wartime shortages. The specific configuration of the bridgework and the arrangement of the surviving tooth and bridge structures matched with notable precision. The descriptions provided independently by Käthe Häusermann and Fritz Echtmann in their 1945 interrogations. The wear patterns on the teeth were consistent with Hitler's known habits and diet, including the significant tooth grinding and clenching that witnesses had described as a feature of his behavior under stress. The French team also noted that the teeth showed no evidence of meat consumption, which is consistent with the well-documented fact that Hitler was a committed vegetarian by the time of the war, having adopted this diet in the early 1930s. The absence of tartar typical of meat-eating diets was a small but notable additional point of consistency. Dr. Charlier and his colleagues published their findings in the European Journal of Internal Medicine in May 2018. Their conclusion was stated, carefully and with appropriate scientific qualification, as proper forensic analysis demands, but its implications were clear. The dental remains held in Russian archives were consistent with being those of Adolf Hitler in multiple independent dimensions: the construction materials, the specific configuration of the bridgework, the match with eyewitness descriptions of Hitler's dental work, the dietary evidence encoded in the tooth structure, and the absence of features inconsistent with what was historically known. The study was peer-reviewed and has been cited approvingly by historians working on this period. It represents the most rigorous and methodologically sound forensic assessment of the Hitler remains that has yet been conducted, and it supports the conclusion that Hitler died in the bunker. Does this definitively close the case? That depends on what standard of proof one demands. No forensic examination, however rigorous, can produce absolute metaphysical certainty about a historical event. The study did not include DNA analysis of the dental remains because, as the researchers noted, such analysis would have required destructive sampling of irreplaceable historical artifacts, and the Russian authorities did not give permission for it. DNA analysis of the dental material might, in principle, provide an even stronger form of identification if a comparative sample from a known Hitler relative could be obtained. But, in the absence of DNA evidence, the combination of the detailed forensic dental match, the consistent eyewitness testimony from multiple independent witnesses, the absence of any credible evidence of escape, and the logical improbabilities of a successful escape under the conditions of April 1945, amounts to a body of evidence that historians and forensic specialists have rightly judged to be compelling. The leading academic authorities on the Hitler period and on Second World War history have, without exception, concluded that Hitler died in the bunker. The Pulitzer Prize-winning historian John Toland, who wrote one of the most detailed biographies of Hitler, concluded that the evidence of death in the bunker was overwhelming. Ian Kershaw, whose 2-volume biography of Hitler is considered the definitive scholarly treatment of the subject, concludes the same. Richard J. Evans, who served as the expert witness for the defense in the Irving versus Lipstadt libel case and who has written extensively on the historiography of the Nazi period, has been categorical in his assessment that the bunker death is established historical fact. Trevor Roper's original 1947 investigation, The Last Days of Hitler, conducted for British intelligence in the immediate post-war period using testimony and documents gathered before they could be lost, remains one of the foundational texts of the subject and reached the same conclusion based on evidence gathered while the events were still fresh and witnesses were still accessible. The academics' consensus, in short, is about as complete as it ever gets on any contested historical question. But let us address one more dimension of the post-war mystery before we turn to the final chapter: the question of why the conspiracy theories have proven so extraordinarily persistent and so resistant to the weight of evidence against them. This is not simply a question about Hitler. It is a question about how human minds respond to events of overwhelming scale and horror, and about the psychological mechanisms that produce and sustain beliefs that evidence cannot dislodge. The death of Adolf Hitler in a Berlin bunker, shot and burned by his own orders as Soviet artillery thundered above, is, in a certain sense, an unsatisfying ending. Here was a man who had caused the deaths of 50 to 80 million people, who had organized the systematic murder of 6 million Jews and millions of others in one of the most carefully planned and industrially executed genocides in human history, who had plunged the world into 6 years of catastrophic war, who had wielded a kind of power over other human beings that history has rarely seen. And he ended, not on a gallows in public, not in a courtroom facing his accusers, not captured and paraded through the streets, but in a small concrete room 50 feet underground at his own hand, having successfully avoided the fate that caught Mussolini and so many others. There was no reckoning, no judgment, no symbolic justice. He died when and how he chose. For many people, survivors of the Holocaust above all, this is psychologically unbearable. The conspiracy theory that he escaped offers, paradoxically, a form of comfort. If he escaped, then perhaps he was eventually found and punished, or perhaps justice might yet be done. The persistence of the escape theories is, in part, a symptom of humanity's legitimate fury at the injustice of his actual end. There is also a broader pattern in which the magnitude of a historical figure's impact seems to demand a death commensurate with that magnitude. Elvis Presley, JFK, Michael Jackson, and numerous other figures of enormous cultural impact have generated persistent survival or conspiracy myths after their deaths. Hitler, whose impact dwarfs all of these, was always going to generate such myths to an extreme degree. The psychological need to impose narrative structure and symbolic justice on history is a powerful human motivation, and when reality fails to provide these things, imagination fills the gap. This is not a character failing or a sign of irrationality. It is a deeply human response to the encounter with historical evil at a scale that defies ordinary comprehension. There is another factor worth noting: the deliberate cultivation of uncertainty by those who had ideological reasons to want Hitler's survival to be believable. In the immediate post-war period, and continuing through the 1950s and 1960s, there were active neo-Nazi and far-right groups in several countries, including Argentina, Germany, and the United States, who found the narrative of Hitler's escape politically useful. A Hitler who had escaped was a Hitler who might return, a Hitler whose ideological project was not dead but merely dormant, a Hitler who represented hope for those who had not abandoned his vision. Books and pamphlets promoting the escape theory were circulated in these communities, and some of the most persistent and detailed escape accounts originated from precisely these ideologically motivated sources. The fact that these accounts were fabrications did not prevent them from being cited, recycled, and amplified by subsequent generations of conspiracy enthusiasts who were unaware of or uninterested in their origins. Consider the case of the book Grey Wolf, The Escape of Adolf Hitler, published in 2011 by two British authors, Simon Dunstan and Gerard Williams. The book presented what it claimed was extensive new evidence that Hitler had escaped to Argentina and lived there until 1962. It received considerable media attention and sold very well. However, it was comprehensively demolished by academic historians, who identified numerous factual errors, fabricated sources, and logical fallacies in its argument. The actual historians who reviewed it were unanimous in their assessment that it presented no credible new evidence and that its claims were without scholarly foundation. But the academic rebuttals received far less media attention than the original book, as is typically the case, and Grey Wolf continued to be cited as if it were a serious historical work by conspiracy-minded internet communities for years after its publication. The lesson of all of this is not that we should dismiss every heterodox historical claim without examination. The lesson is that the standards of historical evidence are not optional luxuries. When all the serious evidence points in one direction and the evidence pointing in the other direction dissolves on close examination into fabrication, misidentification, logical fallacy, or the recycling of ideologically motivated sources, the appropriate intellectual response is to draw the conclusion that the evidence supports, however unsatisfying that conclusion might feel. Hitler died in the bunker. The evidence says so. The witnesses say so. The forensic analysis says so. The logic of the situation says so. And the failure of 70-plus years of searching to produce a single credible piece of evidence that he survived says so most loudly of all. Now let us take stock of what happened to the world he left behind and to the people he had drawn into his orbit of destruction. Because the story of what happened after Hitler is not only the story of his death, it is also the story of what was done to hold his associates accountable, what was done to ensure that nothing like the Third Reich could ever emerge again, and how the world has continued, with imperfect success, to grapple with the legacy of the most catastrophically evil political movement of the modern age. The Nuremberg trials, which we have touched on throughout this account, were themselves a landmark in the history of international law that deserves a fuller treatment than we have yet given them. The decision by the Allied powers to try the Nazi leadership for crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, rather than simply executing them or subjecting them to summary military justice, was not universally popular even among the Allies. Winston Churchill initially favoured summary execution for the leading Nazis, arguing that their guilt was so clear and so enormous that formal trials were a waste of time and potentially gave them a platform. Stalin, with characteristic practicality, also initially preferred execution without trial. It was the Americans, led by Secretary of War Henry Stimson and his assistant John McCloy, who pushed hardest for formal judicial proceedings, arguing that the rule of law demanded that even the greatest criminals be tried before being punished, and that the creation of a legal record would serve future generations better than summary executions that might later be questioned or challenged. This argument prevailed, and the result was the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg, which sat from November 1945 to October 1946 and produced a trial record of extraordinary historical value. The Nuremberg Principles, which were articulated in the tribunal's charter and applied in its judgments, established for the first time in international law that individuals could be held criminally accountable for the decisions they made as heads of state or military commanders, that following orders was not a complete defense to criminal charges, and that certain acts were crimes against humanity, regardless of whether they were legal under the domestic law of the country that committed them. These principles, later codified in the Nuremberg Principles adopted by the United Nations General Assembly in 1950, became the foundation of modern international criminal law and led eventually to the establishment of the International Criminal Court in 2002. The argument that Hitler made the decisions and his subordinates merely carried them out was explicitly rejected at Nuremberg, and the chain of individual criminal responsibility that the tribunal traced through the Nazi hierarchy established a legal framework that has been applied, with varying degrees of success, to subsequent cases of genocide and crimes against humanity around the world. The subsequent Nuremberg trials, which ran from 1946 to 1949 under American jurisdiction after the main tribunal concluded, tried another 185 defendants in 12 separate proceedings covering doctors, judges, industrialists, members of the Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing units, Wehrmacht High Command, and other categories of perpetrators. These trials produced some of the most detailed, legal and historical records of how the Holocaust was planned, organized, and carried out, and they documented the involvement of German society at multiple levels in the crimes of the Nazi state. The doctors' trial, which resulted in the Nuremberg Code governing the ethics of human medical experimentation, was a direct response to the horrifying experiments conducted at Auschwitz and other camps by men like Josef Mengele, Karl Brandt, and others who had used concentration camp prisoners as experimental subjects without their consent. The Einsatzgruppen trial documented the systematic mass shooting of over 1 million Jews in the Soviet Union by mobile killing units, producing a historical record of these crimes that has never been seriously questioned. The industrialists' trials held figures like Alfred Krupp and Friedrich Flick accountable for their use of slave labor, though the sentences in these cases were often disturbingly light, and several defendants were released early in what historians have subsequently judged to be an excessive accommodation of West German political sensitivities during the early Cold War. The Cold War context is crucial to understanding why the full accounting for Nazi crimes was never completed. By 1947 and 1948, the United States and its allies were increasingly focused on the Soviet threat rather than on the pursuit of Nazi war criminals, and a series of practical and political decisions led to the deliberate or negligent release of individuals who should have been tried. German scientists and engineers who had worked on the WW2 rocket program, the jet aircraft program, and other military-industrial projects were recruited by American, British, Soviet, and French intelligence services for their technical expertise, with their Nazi pasts quietly overlooked or actively suppressed. Operation Paperclip, the American program that brought over 100 German scientists and engineers to the United States, included individuals whose wartime activities included the use of slave labor from concentration camps at underground facilities like the Mittelwerk, where V-2 rockets were produced under horrific conditions and thousands of prisoners died. Wernher von Braun, who would go on to lead the American space program that put men on the moon, had been a member of the SS and was fully aware of the conditions at the Mittelwerk. These are the shadows that fall across even the most celebrated post-war achievements. The broader question of what Germany and the world learned from the experience of Nazism and whether the lessons have been adequately absorbed is one that has been debated continuously since 1945 and is unlikely to ever be fully resolved. What can be said with confidence is that the effort to understand how Nazism emerged, how ordinary people became participants in mass murder, and how an entire society was mobilized in the service of a genocidal project has produced one of the richest bodies of historical Psychological and sociological scholarship in existence. From Hannah Arendt's concept of the banality of evil, developed from her reporting on the Eichmann trial, to Christopher Browning's meticulous study of the men of Reserve Police Battalion 101, who carried out mass shootings of Jews in Poland, to Daniel Goldhagen's controversial thesis about the role of a specific German cultural tradition of eliminationist anti-Semitism, the question of how the Holocaust happened has generated profound and sometimes deeply uncomfortable insights into the human capacity for organized cruelty. And what of the bunker itself, that concrete labyrinth beneath the Reich Chancellery garden, where the story of Hitler's death and the conspiracy theories it spawned both began? The Führer bunker survived the war structurally intact, buried under its earthen mound, while the Reich Chancellery above it was reduced to a bombed-out shell. The Soviets explored it thoroughly, stripped it of anything useful, and then essentially left it alone. When Berlin was divided between the Allied powers, the bunker ended up in the Soviet sector, which became East Berlin and eventually the capital of the German Democratic Republic. The East German government, finding the bunker's existence an embarrassment given the official narrative of communist anti-fascism, made several attempts to demolish it. A partial demolition in the 1950s weakened the structure but left much of it intact, given the extraordinary thickness of the reinforced concrete walls. Another demolition attempt in the 1980s similarly failed to fully destroy it. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989 and Germany was reunified, the bunker once again became the responsibility of the federal government. After extensive debate about what to do with it, the decision was made neither to preserve it as a museum nor to publicly excavate it, but rather to leave it where it is, sealed under an ordinary-looking parking lot and housing development in central Berlin. A small, discreet information board marks the location today. There are no dramatic signs, no exhibits, no gift shop. The Führer bunker lies in its anonymity, undisturbed a few meters underground, just as it has been for 80 years. This studied understatement is, in many ways, entirely appropriate. Germany has made a long and largely successful effort to confront and memorialize the crimes of the Nazi period in ways that honor the victims without creating shrines to the perpetrators. The Holocaust Memorial in Berlin, formerly known as the Memorial to the Murdered Jews of Europe, which was opened in 2005 just a few blocks from the site of the bunker, stands in stark contrast to the invisible, deliberately unmarked location of Hitler's death. The victims are remembered. The perpetrator is consigned to a parking lot. There is a certain justice in this, even if it is not the courtroom justice that history denied. We have spoken at some length about the men of Hitler's inner circle and their post-war fates, but there are crucial figures we haven't yet fully addressed, whose stories add important dimensions to the complete picture of what happened after Hitler. Eva Braun, the woman who chose to die beside him, was in many ways the most personally enigmatic figure in Hitler's immediate orbit. She had been his companion for over a decade, kept deliberately out of the public eye because Hitler believed that his public appeal as Germany's leader was enhanced by the impression of a man wholly dedicated to his nation rather than to any individual. Eva Braun was not allowed to attend public functions with him, was rarely photographed in circumstances that identified her relationship to Hitler, and was largely unknown to the German public during the war years. She spent much of the war at the Berghof, Hitler's mountain retreat in Berchtesgaden, living in comfortable isolation, shopping, photographing everything she saw with a personal camera whose films have survived watching films and waiting for the occasional visits of a man who was running a world war and who treated her, at least according to her own diary and the accounts of people who knew them both, with a kind of genuine, if limited, affection that coexisted with his complete domination of her life. She was 23 years younger than Hitler, had worked as an assistant in a Munich photography studio owned by his personal photographer Heinrich Hoffmann when they met, and had attempted suicide twice before settling into her role as the hidden companion of a dictator. Eva Braun died in the bunker on April 30th, 1945, at the age of 33 by cyanide poisoning. Her body was burned in the garden alongside Hitler's. The charred remains recovered by the Soviets have never been definitively separated from his. She was not tried for any crime, had never held any formal political position, and was not formally part of the regime in any institutional sense. Whether she knew the Full extent of what was being done in the name of the man she loved is a question that has interested historians and biographers without producing a fully satisfying answer. The photographs she took at the Berghof show a world of mountain scenery, afternoon teas, and well-dressed guests in what looks, superficially, like a very pleasant country house. Nothing in those photographs acknowledges the war, the Holocaust, or the suffering that was being orchestrated from nearby offices. Whether this represents genuine ignorance, willful blindness, or the careful self-censorship of a woman who understood what not to document is something we cannot know with certainty. Traudl Junge, Hitler's secretary who had typed his final testament and personal will in the small hours of April 29, 1945, survived the bunker and the escape attempt through Berlin, and was eventually captured briefly by Soviet forces before making her way west and surrendering to American forces. She was questioned extensively, gave detailed accounts of her time in the bunker, and eventually published a memoir in 2002, just months before her death from cancer, titled Until the Final Hour. The memoir, which was also turned into a film documentary in which she spoke directly to camera, is one of the most valuable first-person accounts of life in Hitler's inner circle and in the bunker during its final days. Junge grappled throughout her later life with the question of her own moral responsibility, not for any active crimes, but for the choices that had led her to serve so long and so faithfully in Hitler's personal household. In the documentary, she describes the moment she realized that on the same day she had been telling herself she was too young and naive to have understood what was happening around her, Sophie Scholl had been executed for distributing anti-Nazi leaflets. Sophie Scholl was the same age as Junge. She had understood. The comparison haunted her. The Goebbels family fate, which we mentioned briefly earlier, deserves more detailed treatment because it represents one of the most disturbing episodes of the entire bunker story and raises profound questions about fanaticism, parental obligation, and the catastrophic extremes to which ideological commitment can drive human beings. Joseph Goebbels had been Hitler's minister of propaganda from the earliest days of the Third Reich, the man who had used his genius for mass communication and psychological manipulation to build the Führer cult, to orchestrate the persecution of Jews, to manage the flow of information to the German public with consummate skill, and to maintain the fiction of eventual victory well past the point where any rational observer could have believed it. He was perhaps the most intellectually gifted member of Hitler's inner circle, fluent in 4 languages, the holder of a doctorate in literature, a man of genuine rhetorical brilliance who had chosen to put those gifts entirely in the service of evil. His wife Magda was equally committed, perhaps even more so. She had been one of the most visible women in the Third Reich, the ideal of the Nazi vision of German womanhood, a beautiful, devoted wife and mother who had stood beside her husband at countless public events. The decision that Magda Goebbels made in the bunker to administer fatal cyanide to her 6 children rather than allow them to grow up in a world without National Socialism is one that psychologists and historians have analysed at length without fully explaining it. The children, ranging in age from 4 to 12, were sedated first, the sedative mixed into their food. Once they were unconscious, cyanide was administered. Exactly how Magda accomplished this and whether any of the children showed signs of resistance or awakening is mercifully not documented in the surviving accounts. What is documented is the result. All 6 children were dead by the early hours of May 1st, 1945. Their names were Helga, Hildegard, Helmut, Holdine, Hedwig and Heidrun. The eldest, Helga, was 12 years old. Photographs of the 6 children taken in happier times during the war years have survived and are frequently reproduced in historical accounts of this period. They show ordinary-looking children in ordinary clothes, smiling for the camera, entirely unaware of their fate. Looking at those photographs now is an exercise in moral horror that no amount of historical distance makes easier. After killing her children, Magda Goebbels died in the Reich Chancellery Garden on the evening of May 1st, shot in the back of the head, almost certainly by an SS guard following her instructions after she herself had taken cyanide. Joseph Goebbels died beside her, either by shooting or by poison. The exact sequence is uncertain. Their bodies were partially burned but not consumed, and were found by Soviet troops shortly after. Joseph Goebbels was 47 years old. He had served Hitler for over 20 years, from the early days of the movement to the very last hours of the Reich. In his final diary entries, which have been preserved and published, there is no remorse, no acknowledgement of the catastrophic consequences of the ideology he had served. no recognition of the millions of deaths for which he bore a significant share of responsibility. There is only the familiar rhetoric, the messianic language, the unshaken belief that history would vindicate them. Now let us consider a group of people whose post-war experience adds yet another dimension to this story. Those who were not senior Nazi officials, but who had nonetheless been drawn into the machinery of the regime and who were left to navigate the complicated terrain of guilt, accountability, and survival in a post-war Germany that needed to be rebuilt even as it reckoned with its crimes. The question of collective guilt and individual responsibility that emerged from the Nazi experience was one of the defining moral and philosophical questions of the post-war period. Karl Jaspers, the German philosopher who resumed his academic career after the war, having survived the Nazi period at some personal risk, wrote an influential essay in 1946 titled The Question of German Guilt, in which he distinguished between criminal guilt, which applied only to those who had directly committed crimes, political guilt, which applied to all citizens of a state that had committed crimes in their name, moral guilt, which applied to those who had looked away or failed to act, and metaphysical guilt, which he argued applied to all human beings who had survived while others died. This framework was and remains controversial, but it attempted to do something important, to distribute moral responsibility across a spectrum without either holding everyone equally culpable or allowing individuals to escape by hiding behind collective innocence. The denazification process that the Allied powers attempted to implement in occupied Germany after the war was an imperfect and ultimately not wholly successful effort to apply some version of this framework in practical institutional terms. Millions of forms were distributed, requiring every German adult to declare their involvement or lack of involvement with the Nazi Party and its organizations. Tribunals were established to classify individuals along a spectrum from major war criminals through lesser offenders to nominal members and exonerated persons. The sheer scale of the task overwhelmed the available resources, and the process was plagued by what Germans came to call whitewashing, as individuals with genuine culpability found ways to present themselves as harmless followers or innocent bystanders. The tribunals were wound down by the late 1940s with a general sense that the job had been imperfectly done. Many individuals who deserved trial or serious sanction escaped with mild classifications. Many institutions, including the German judiciary, the medical profession and the civil service, were allowed to reconstitute themselves with significant continuity of personnel from the Nazi period. The legacy of this imperfect reckoning was a Germany that, in the 1960s and 1970s, was forced to confront the inadequacy of what had been done in the immediate post-war period. A new generation of West Germans, born after or during the war and raised in a society that had largely refused to speak openly about what had happened, began asking questions that their parents and grandparents could not comfortably answer. The Frankfurt Auschwitz trials of 1963 to 1965, in which former camp personnel were prosecuted under West German law for murders committed at Auschwitz, were in part a response to this generational pressure. They produced some convictions, but also demonstrated how difficult it was to prosecute crimes that had been committed 20 years earlier when witnesses were dead. Memories had faded, and the perpetrators had spent 2 decades successfully living normal lives in German society. The trials were nonetheless important in forcing a public confrontation with what had been done in the camps that the earlier denazification process had not fully achieved. West Germany eventually became one of the most effective examples of what scholars call transitional justice, the process by which a society confronts and attempts to account for the crimes of a previous regime. The Basic Law of 1949, which served as West Germany's constitution, was specifically designed to prevent a recurrence of the legal and institutional pathways that had allowed the Weimar Republic to be subverted by the Nazis. The Holocaust denial laws, the mandatory history education in German schools, the extensive network of memorials and documentation centres, the continued work of the Central Office of the Investigation of National Socialist Crimes, which has pursued prosecutions of former Nazis well into the 21st century, including the convictions of former Auschwitz guards in their 90s, are all parts of a comprehensive national effort to ensure that the memory of what happened is maintained and that the principle of accountability, however imperfectly applied in the immediate aftermath, remains alive. East Germany, under Soviet-style communist rule, took a very different approach. The official GDR narrative held that the Nazi period was a product of capitalism and imperialism, that the communist state was by definition the opposite of Nazism, and therefore that the citizens of the GDR bore no collective responsibility for what had happened. This convenient but historically dishonest position allowed East Germany to avoid many of the difficult confrontations with its own past that West Germany, however imperfectly, attempted to engage with. Former Nazis who professed communist sympathies were able to rebuild their careers in the GDR with relative ease. The GDR did not implement anything like the denazification process, did not pursue systematic prosecution of war criminals, and its state propaganda portrayed Nazism as an exclusively West German problem. This approach had long-term consequences, as became apparent after reunification in 1990, when the populations of the former East Germany showed higher rates of support for right-wing extremism than those of the former West, a pattern that historians have attributed, at least in part, to the failure of the East German state to foster genuine confrontation with the Nazi past. The question of what can be definitively known about Adolf Hitler's fate after the war has now been examined from every angle, and the answer that emerges is clear, even if it will never satisfy everyone. Hitler died in the Führer bunker in Berlin on April 30th, 1945. He shot himself in the head, possibly also taking cyanide simultaneously, in the private study of his underground quarters, while Soviet forces fought their way toward the Reich Chancellery. Just blocks away, his body was burned in the garden above the bunker on his own instructions, along with the body of Eva Braun, who died of cyanide poisoning beside him. The Soviet investigation that followed produced dental evidence that has been confirmed by the most rigorous modern forensic analysis as consistent with being Hitler's remains. The skull fragment that briefly appeared to cast doubt on the Soviet findings was identified by DNA analysis as belonging to a woman, almost certainly unrelated to Hitler, that had been misattributed to him in the Soviet archives. Every serious historian of the period has concluded, on the basis of the totality of evidence, that Hitler died in the bunker. The escape theories, which have circulated since 1945, are not supported by any credible evidence. The FBI files document the investigation of claims that were almost universally found to be without foundation. The CIA documents cited by conspiracy theorists are raw intelligence reports of unverified claims, not assessments of credible evidence. The U-boats that arrived in Argentina months after the surrender were commanded by young naval officers who gave credible and consistent accounts of their voyages and who have been thoroughly investigated by multiple intelligence services without any evidence of VIP passengers emerging. The ratlines that helped Nazi war criminals escape to South America were real and historically documented, but there is no credible evidence that Hitler was among those who used them. Martin Bormann, whose fate was uncertain for decades and whose alleged sightings in South America were used to argue for the plausibility of Hitler's escape, died in Berlin in the early hours of May 1, 1945, as DNA evidence confirmed in 1998. The conspiracy theories persist because Hitler's actual death was psychologically unsatisfying, because the human desire for narrative justice is powerful, because some people have ideological reasons to want the theories to survive, and because the deliberate obfuscation practiced by Stalin in the immediate post-war period created a window of genuine uncertainty that was exploited for decades. But the evidence, when assessed with honesty and rigor, points overwhelmingly in one direction. The man who started the most destructive war in human history, who organized the systematic murder of 6 million Jews and millions of others, who brought death and suffering to virtually every corner of the inhabited world, died in a concrete room 50 feet underground while the city he had turned into a fortress crumbled around him. He shot himself. His body was burned. The Soviet army walked over his ashes, and that is where the story of Adolf Hitler actually ends. What does not end, and what we should be careful never to allow to end, is the work of understanding how it happened. The rise of Adolf Hitler to power was not inevitable. The Holocaust was not inevitable. Every step of the way there were choices made by individuals, and at each choice point different choices were possible. The German voters who gave the Nazi Party its plurality in the elections of 1932 were not all fanatics. Many of them were frightened people looking for strong leadership in a time of economic crisis and national humiliation. The business leaders and aristocrats who thought they could use Hitler for their own purposes and then discard him were not stupid men. They were simply wrong in ways that proved catastrophically consequential. The governments of Britain and France that chose appeasement over confrontation at Munich in 1938 were not cowardly by nature. They were trying to avoid another world war and failed to understand what they were dealing with. The lesson is not that people are evil. The lesson is that evil can succeed when ordinary institutions fail, when democratic norms erode, when scapegoating replaces honest analysis of social problems, when the capacity for outrage is numbed by incremental escalation, and when the checks and balances that constrain power are systematically dismantled. These are lessons that each generation must learn again, because each generation faces its own versions of the pressures and temptations that allowed Nazism to flourish. The historians, the educators, the documentary filmmakers, the journalists, and yes, the YouTube channels dedicated to explaining this history to new audiences are all engaged in work that matters in ways that transcend entertainment or intellectual curiosity. Understanding what really happened in all its complexity and horror is one of the most important things any of us can do. It is the reason the story of what happened to Hitler after the war is worth telling carefully and telling true. Because the truth, however unsatisfying it may be compared to the conspiracy theories, is always worth more than a comfortable fiction. The Führer bunker stands, sealed and silent, beneath a Berlin parking lot. Above it, the city that Hitler destroyed has been rebuilt, reunified and transformed into one of the most vital and dynamic capitals in the world. The memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe stands a few hundred meters away. Its 2,711 concrete stelae of varying heights, creating a maze through which visitors walk in solemnity and reflection. The Reichstag, the building before which Hitler had consolidated his power, now houses the democratically elected German parliament and is topped by a glass dome open to the public, designed by the architect Norman Foster as a symbol of transparency and accountability in government. The Germany that Hitler promised would last 1,000 years lasted 12. The Germany that was built on the ruins he left behind has now lasted 80 years as a democracy and shows every sign of lasting a great deal longer. This, perhaps more than any forensic finding, is the most fitting answer to the question of what really happened after Hitler. The world he sought to create did not survive him. The world that opposed him did. Well, that is it. Thanks for watching. We hope you found this video informative and that the full story of what really happened to Hitler after the Second World War has given you a richer understanding of one of the most dramatic and consequential periods in modern history. If you enjoyed learning about today's topic, make sure to check out our video about what happened to Germany's top field marshals after World War II, where we take a deep dive into the post-war fates of the men who commanded Hitler's armies. And do not miss our look at what happened to the children of Nazi leaders after the war, for an even more intimate portrait of the human dimensions of this history. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on more World War II content. See you in the next one. Before we reach our conclusion, however, there are several more threads of this extraordinary story that demand our attention because the aftermath of Hitler's death rippled through people and institutions in ways that continue to unfold for decades. We have spoken about the major figures, but what about those in the middle ranks, the bureaucrats and professionals and military officers who were not major war criminals by the standards applied at Nuremberg, but who had nonetheless been deeply complicit in the mechanisms of the Nazi state? Their stories, taken together, paint a picture of post-war justice that is as much about failure and compromise as it is about accountability. Hans Frank, who served as Governor-General of occupied Poland and presided over a territory in which the systematic murder of millions of Jews and Poles was carried out, was one of the more dramatically transformed figures at Nuremberg. Frank had been a lawyer before the war, a man of genuine intellectual sophistication, and during the trial he underwent what appeared to many observers as a genuine and profound conversion to Catholicism and to an acknowledgement of his own guilt. He said at his trial, "1,000 years will pass and still Germany's guilt will not have been erased," words that have been quoted in countless histories of the period. Whether this conversion was genuine or a cynical calculation to influence the tribunal is debated by historians. It did not save him from the gallows. Frank was hanged on October 16, 1946. Whatever sincerity his final words contained, They could not undo the deaths of the millions who had perished under his governance. Julius Streicher presents a different kind of moral complexity. Streicher was the publisher of the virulently anti-Semitic newspaper Der Stürmer, and was, in the assessment of almost everyone who knew him, a genuine sadist and pornographer of hatred. A man who seemed to take personal pleasure in the dehumanization of Jews in the most graphic and degrading terms. His newspaper, which was distributed widely throughout Germany and was displayed in public notice boards in many towns, was one of the primary instruments of popular anti-Semitism in the Nazi state. Streicher had been stripped of his official positions in 1940, following a power struggle with Goering, and he spent the war years in enforced retirement on his Bavarian estate, technically out of power but still publishing. At Nuremberg, he was tried not for any specific act of violence or murder, but for incitement to genocide, for the argument that his publications had directly contributed to creating the climate of dehumanization that made the Holocaust possible. He was found guilty and hanged. The precedent was significant. For the first time, a court had held that words and ideas, not just actions, could constitute crimes against humanity when those words were systematically used to prepare a population for genocide. Arthur Seyss-Inquart, the Austrian Nazi who had been the Reich Commissioner for the occupied Netherlands, was a figure whose post-war trial illuminated the particular horror of the Holocaust as it was implemented in Western Europe. Under his administration, between 1940 and 1945, approximately 102,000 of the approximately 140,000 Jews in the Netherlands were deported to death camps. The Netherlands lost a higher proportion of its Jewish population than any other Western European country, a fact that has haunted Dutch national memory ever since, and that historians have attributed to a combination of the particularly efficient Nazi administrative apparatus that Seyss-Inquart established, the relative flatness and density of the Dutch terrain which made hiding difficult, and certain features of Dutch society and administration that inadvertently facilitated the deportations. Among those deported under Seyss-Inquart's administration was Anne Frank, whose diary, found in the Amsterdam hiding place where she and her family had lived for 2 years before their betrayal and arrest in August 1944, has become one of the most widely read books in history. Seyss-Inquart was found guilty at Nuremberg on charges of conspiracy, crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, and was hanged on October 16, 1946. The story of what happened to Ernst Kaltenbrunner is worth dwelling on because of the particular nature of his crimes. Kaltenbrunner, an Austrian who stood 6 feet 4 inches tall and was a figure of physical intimidation even by SS standards, had succeeded Reinhard Heydrich as head of the Reich Security Main Office after Heydrich's assassination by Czech resistance fighters in Prague in May 1942. In this role, Kaltenbrunner had direct operational oversight of the Gestapo, the SD intelligence service, and the apparatus of the final solution. He was present at demonstrations of killing techniques in concentration camps. He signed execution orders personally. He was, in the most literal and direct sense, one of the primary architects of the machinery of mass murder in its operational phase. At Nuremberg, he attempted to deny knowledge of the crimes committed under his jurisdiction, a defense that was demolished by documentary evidence, including personal correspondence and orders bearing his signature. He was found guilty on all applicable counts and hanged. What happened to the many thousands of lower-ranking perpetrators who escaped the Nuremberg net and the subsequent trials? The vast majority of them returned to ordinary life. They married, raised families, ran businesses, practiced professions, and were protected by a combination of the practical impossibility of prosecuting every participant in the Nazi system, the deliberate obstruction of post-war investigations by former colleagues, the general post-war desire in Germany to turn the page and rebuild, and the Cold War prioritization that led Western governments to value German political cooperation over the pursuit of historical justice. A 2017 investigation by the New York Times found that the United States government had paid pension benefits to at least 38 former Nazi war criminals who had become American citizens, in some cases continuing payments even after the individuals had been stripped of their citizenship and deported. The names included former SS guards and others who had participated in atrocities. The payments, made under Social Security and other programs, were the result of administrative failures and the failure of different government agencies to share information effectively. They are a small but telling indicator of how thoroughly the mechanisms of accountability failed in the decades after the war. The Simon Wiesenthal Center and the independent Nazi hunters who pursued escaped war criminals in the decades after the war performed work of extraordinary importance, both for the practical purpose of bringing some perpetrators to justice and for the symbolic purpose of demonstrating that the world had not forgotten. Simon Wiesenthal himself, who had survived multiple concentration camps and lost nearly all of his family, dedicated his life after the war to documenting the crimes of the Nazi period and locating perpetrators who had escaped justice. His documentation center in Vienna gathered information on over 90,000 Nazi suspects and contributed to the prosecution of over 1,100 individuals. He played a role in the identification of Adolf Eichmann in Argentina, which led to Eichmann's capture and trial. He worked for decades to maintain pressure on governments that were slow or reluctant to pursue Nazi criminals. He died in 2005 at the age of 96, and his work is continued by the organization that bears his name. Beate and Serge Klaasfeld, the German-French couple who dedicated their lives to identifying and exposing Nazi war criminals living under false identities, were responsible for the unmasking of Klaus Barbie in Bolivia and played crucial roles in numerous other prosecutions. Their work demonstrated that individuals acting with determination and moral clarity could accomplish what governments were often too cautious or too compromised to attempt. The persistence of prosecutions into the 21st century is one of the more remarkable aspects of the post-war legal reckoning. In 2011, a former Sobibor death camp guard named John Demjanjuk, who had lived in Ohio for decades under a false identity, claiming to have been an ordinary Soviet prisoner of war, was convicted in a German court of being an accessory to the murder of 28,060 people at the Sobibor extermination camp. He was 91 years old at the time of his conviction. In 2015, Oskar Gruning, a former Auschwitz guard who had been known as the bookkeeper of Auschwitz because he counted and organized the currency taken from arriving prisoners, was convicted at the age of 93 as an accessory to murder. In 2019, a former SS guard at the Stutthof concentration camp near Danzig was charged with accessory to murder. He was 93 years old. These prosecutions, conducted so many decades after the events in question, have been criticized by some as being more symbolic than substantive, given the advanced ages of the defendants and their limited sentences. But they are also statements of principle, that there is no statute of limitations on crimes against humanity, that age and time do not erase responsibility, and that the legal obligation to hold perpetrators to account survives the perpetrator's own preference to be left in peace. The world's relationship with the history of the Nazi period has been shaped above all by the testimony of survivors. The survivors of the concentration camps, the death marches, the mobile killing units, the ghettos, and the hiding places who came forward to give their accounts in the years and decades after the war created a documentary record of individual human experience that no amount of official documentation could replicate. The Shoah Foundation, founded by director Steven Spielberg following the production of Schindler's List, has collected and archived over 55,000 video testimonies from survivors and witnesses of the Holocaust in 65 countries and in 40 languages. This archive, now housed at the University of Southern California, represents one of the largest collections of personal testimony ever assembled and ensures that the human dimension of what happened will remain accessible to future generations long after the last survivors have died. The last survivors are dying now. Within the next decade or two, there will be no one left who personally experienced the events as an adult. The responsibility for maintaining the memory and the understanding of what it means passes to those of us who only know it through testimony, document, and the diligent work of historians.